book of Hebrews is one that every Christian needs to take to heart in a very big way. And the really nice thing about Hebrews is it's full of exhortation and it's full of encouragement. And both of those things are things that the Christian needs to navigate this life. It matters not, but I'll tell you it's probably my second favorite book in the New Testament. Romans being number one. Romans is absolute genius, and it's just a beautiful book to read. But this book is a very close second for me because of the message, because it is so relevant to our Christian existence, and because it is possible to turn back from God. We've got to be so careful. And this book gives us good reason not to do that. Toward the end of the message, we're going to look at something that will kind of get us into next week's lesson, the beginning of the book. But this idea of faith and why we should have faith in the Christ. Chapter 1 that we will begin next week just blows it out of the water. It's a beautiful chapter on the superiority of Jesus Christ. So, I hope you'll stick with us throughout the time that we're going to have together. I want to tell you my approach to the book today. I actually began by, I just thought, well, I'm going to count the number of verses in the book, divided by the number of weeks we have, and there you go. We'll cover it that way. Well, I started putting lessons together. And I started finding out you could probably spend the whole quarter on one or two verses. Seriously. So I ditched that, and my approach is to cover this adequately. I want us to get the message. I want us to understand what the writer here is saying to us because of the importance of the message. So I'm really not concerned about how many verses we cover in a lesson or even if we finish the book by the time our time is up, because my thinking is if we don't finish the book, hopefully we'll be given a chance to do that maybe in another quarter. But as I looked at it, I just kept thinking it just wouldn't be right to just fly through to say we got done. I owe you more than that to bring this this book to your attention. And so that's the way I'm approaching it, and I hope that's okay with you. We're going to get as far as we can, but we're going to do it adequately so that the message can be treasured by each person that is in the class. And it really is a phenomenal book. Today, what I want to do is introduce the book to you. We won't be getting into the passage till next week. But I think it is important. Any book of the Bible that you decide that you want to take under study, it's a really good idea to get some background on it. It really helps in understanding what you're reading, why it's written, those kinds of things, who it's written to. Those are the kind of things that we want to talk about this morning. And then near the end, I want to get into something that is so prevalent in the book as to why it is and how important it is, and show you a couple of examples from the New Testament that help us to see the importance of understanding who it is that we put our faith in. So, today we begin the study of the book of Hebrews. It is a very convicting book. And it is a message that we need to take to heart because, as Peter says, the devil is running around like a roaring lion to destroy who he can. That includes us. We live in a world, we live in a culture that constantly tries to pull us away from the moorings of our faith. This book is the antidote to that. The goal of the book is to exhort us to love Jesus and acknowledge His Lordship in our lives. And the reason for that is because he's superior in everything. Everything. And so as we travel through the book, we're going to be encouraged over and over to lay hold of the Christ, our great high priest, and to go on to Christian maturity. I thought this was a pretty good summation. The great object of Hebrews, then, is to set before these believers' eyes Christ, the Son of God, the Son of Man, the great high priest in heaven, and to cause them constantly to occupy their thought and worship with God, into whose presence Christ, by his blood, has brought them. That's a pretty good summation of the book. Everything up there that you see is going to be addressed in the book in a timely fashion and in a thorough fashion. So let's begin by looking at a few things about the book. Who wrote it? Well, we don't know. There's a great amount of, not controversy, but a great amount of people on one side or the other about particular authors. Certainly Paul is brought out as a possibility. Apollos, Luke, Barnabas, they're all possibilities. But as I read about and studied about the background of the book, to those who know the Greek language well, and I don't, but to those who do, say that the man who wrote this book was a man of culture and he had a mastery of the language. He also had an intimate knowledge of the Septuagint. Everything he quotes in the book from the Old Testament comes out of the Septuagint. And he was very familiar with Jewish life and customs. There are those who are convinced it's Paul. But there's evidences within the book that maybe point away from him. For those who, again, understand the Greek language and can make distinctions about it, it's said that the style of the book is quite different than what Paul's books are. That this is far more polished and refined than any of Paul's recognized epistles. There's a statement that's made in the book that would tend to point away from Paul too. Hebrews 2:3, how shall we escape if we neglect so great a salvation, which at first began to be spoken by the Lord and was confirmed to us by those who heard him? The author doesn't seem to place himself in the company of those who heard Jesus personally. And that certainly wouldn't be Paul, if you think about the road to Damascus. Seems to be a strange thing to say if Paul's the author. I went back and looked at every epistle that Paul is said to have written in the New Testament, and every one of them, without fail, started with a salutation from Paul. I, Paul. This one doesn't do that. It just jumps right immediately into the subject, God. The author also appears to have been a part of the group to which he wrote. But I especially urge you to do this, that I may be restored to you the sooner. It's really important to understand that whoever wrote the book, and specifically whether Paul wrote the book or not, the authority of the book doesn't rest upon who the author is, because the author is not claimed in that book. It doesn't say anything about who the author is. And regarding the authorship, Origen probably said it best. He said, God alone knows. But I found this anonymous quote to be very worthwhile. There is no portion of Scripture whose authorship is more disputed, nor any of which the inspiration is more indisputable. We can have our conversations about who we think the author is, but ultimately, the inspiration of the book is just indisputable. Well, when was the book written? What's the time of Hebrews? Well, the latest possible date would be somewhere in the neighborhood of 96 AD, because we have evidence that Clement of Rome used the book. But the earliest date's not easy to fix. The earliest epistles are dated somewhere in the neighborhood of 49, 48, 49, 50 AD. So that gives you kind of a working time frame, 48 to 96. But they say that one of the interesting points of the book, especially since it's written to a Jewish audience, is that there's absolutely no mention in the book of the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. So in terms of trying to date the book, most people kind of come to the conclusion that it's written somewhere in the mid-60s, 64 to late 60s, 68 AD. The sacrificial system of the old Jewish law is mentioned several times in the book, but the book does not mention the event that ended that, destruction of Jerusalem. So for that reason, maybe the mid-60s. Well, who was it written to? Well, the bulk of the evidence is that it was written to Jewish Christians. The ancient title of the book, we do have that, was to the Hebrews. There is frequent use of the Old Testament as an unquestioned authority in the book. There is an assumed knowledge of the sacrificial system and the many contrasts between Christianity and Judaism. And it's designed to prevent Jewish Christians from returning to Judaism. The book identifies the readers in this way. And so, dear brothers and sisters who belong to God and are partners with those who call to heaven, think carefully about this Jesus whom we declare to be God's messenger and high priest. So clearly, it's written to Jewish Christians. Well, where was it written? Where was it written to? Again, there's really no way to know this for sure. The two most prominent places that are mentioned in terms of those who have tried to delve into that is to Jerusalem or to Rome. But again, there's internal evidence that would seem to indicate it would not have been written to Jerusalem. It would seem that Jewish residents would not be characterized by the description in Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 3 confirmed to us by those who heard him. Because some would have been eyewitnesses to the ministry of Jesus and heard him for themselves, living in Jerusalem. And Hebrews 12:4 doesn't fit the circumstances at Jerusalem. He writes to the Christians here, "You have not yet resisted to bloodshed, striving against sin." Now we know that's not the case in Jerusalem. We have the example certainly of Stephen and the example of James, who was put to death there. So it would seem that that would tend to push away from the idea that it was written to Jewish Christians in Jerusalem. And then, near the end of the book, greet all those who rule over you and all the saints. Those from Italy greet you. So it kind of gives you the idea that maybe those from Italy that were not in Italy at the time were sending back greetings to those to whom the book was written. Again, doesn't matter. I think we understand that it is Jewish Christians it's being written to, but it would seem that Rome would be more reasonable choice than Jerusalem. Then we have description of the recipients of the letter. And so, dear brothers and sisters who belong to God and are partners with those who call to heaven, think carefully about this Jesus whom we declare to be God's messenger and high priest. It is just more than evident that these are Christians this is being written to, and specifically Jewish Christians. They were believers. who had become to the faith through the testimony of the eyewitness to Christ. How shall we escape if we neglect so great a salvation, which at the first began to be spoken by the Lord and was confirmed to us by those who heard him? They were not new Christians. For though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you again the first principles of the oracles of God. And you have come to need milk and not solid food. Now, certainly when we get to Hebrews 5, we're going to talk a lot more about that. But that point needs to be taken to heart by all of us. We need to be growing in Christ. There's no standing still. There's no backing away from it. We need to be growing in the Christ, and there is no age that we reach where that's not necessary anymore. Always growing in the Christ. But these Christians, it said, ought to have grown some, and they haven't. And that's a problem. Here may be why. They were dull of hearing, of whom we have much to say and hard to explain, since you have become dull of hearing. Do you ever find yourself in a Bible class or a sermon just shutting down? Just not even listening? The message doesn't really mean that much to you. It doesn't touch your heart anymore. Dullness of hearing is a dangerous place to be. The writer is going to let us know why that is as we move along. It's obvious that they had endured some hardships and persecutions in the past. But recall the former days in which, after you were illuminated, you endured a great struggle with sufferings. Partly while you were made a spectacle both by reproaches and tribulations, and partly while you became companions of those who were so treated. For you had compassion on me in my chains, and joyfully accepted the plundering of your goods, knowing that you have a better and an enduring possession for yourselves in heaven. And here's one of the big problems he addresses in the book. Therefore, we must give the more earnest heed to the things we have heard, lest we drift away. Every one of us can possibly fall prey to that, to begin moving away from Christ. And it doesn't have to happen in an overnight decision. It can happen little by little by little, and all of a sudden, no longer are we in contact with Christ at that point. We'll be talking a lot about that. And the author also, again near the end of the book, appealed to them. And I appeal to you, brethren, bear with the word of exhortation, for I've written to you in few words. So he found a need to write to them to try to check this downward spiral that he was either seeing for himself or had heard about, that those who had claimed the Christ at one point had become dull of hearing and were possibly drifting away from Christ and ultimately rejecting him to go back into Judaism. And you can kind of understand that part of that process may have been what we mentioned earlier, is the reproach that was brought upon them, probably by Jews that were not Christians, just, hearing and taking that every day, and so they were moving away from the Christ. Well, what's the purpose of the book? The author makes it clear that there is renewed persecution on the horizon. He makes it clear that they are about to lapse back into Judaism, and so to avoid it, the author makes the plea to remain strong in the faith, and he does this with the emphasis of declaring the superiority of Jesus and the superiority of Christianity over Judaism. The theme of the epistle is the absoluteness of the Christian religion because of the absoluteness of the superiority of the Christ. It's based upon his preeminence, the one and only true mediator of salvation. And so to this end, the author shows that Christianity is better than Judaism. He shows that the new covenant is superior to the old. He shows the importance of growing in Christian maturity. He's attempting to keep these Christians from apostatizing. He's preparing them for coming persecution, and he's warning them against false teachers. I like this quote. The knowledge and assurance of how great this high priest Jesus is should lift the drifting believer from spiritual lethargy to vital Christian maturity. Stated another way, the antidote for backsliding is a growing personal knowledge of Christ. And I think that's why he starts the book with that. He is going to describe the Christ in glorious terms. It's one of the grandest descriptions of the Christ in all the Bible in that first chapter. And I would say this, if it doesn't get you fired up to hear it, if it doesn't get you fired up to understand who Jesus is, maybe you've become dull of hearing. Maybe you're beginning to drift. I have no idea how anyone can read the first chapter of Hebrews and not come out of there just completely fired up because of the message that he brings, using the Old Testament to show the truth of what he's telling them. He hits them in their ballpark. Now listen, you may be sitting there thinking, there is no way on earth that I am going to return to Judaism. What has this book got to do for me? Listen, that's just one aspect of becoming dull of hearing and moving away from Christ. There are multitudes of things, and we're going to look at those as we go along in the book. There are multitudes of things that can pull you away from Jesus. The overall message of the Christ, to stay true to him, is true even though, no, Judaism is no temptation to those that are here today, I'm sure. But there are other temptations that can take you away from him. And so the message stands. It is as relevant today as when this man wrote the book to those struggling Jewish Christians of that time. And so all of this, that Jesus is better, is meant to show his superiority and to show that any claim by anybody that there's something better than him, equal to him, is absolute nonsense. And so the author asks, why in the world would you go back to something that is lesser? But they, as we, can have our attention diverted. We can be tempted. We can be frightened. We can be pressured into serving other voices and other things. And so this book is going to help us tremendously in checking out our lives, examining ourselves, and making sure that we aren't moving away. Well, that gives you a little bit of the introductory ideas about the book. As I said, next week we are going to begin the book, and I look forward to that. But here at the end of our lesson today, I want us to look at a couple of passages in Scripture that really help to remind us of something that is critical, and that's really what this book is trying to stress to the Christians that he was writing to in that day, that it's really critical for us to retain in our understanding. Faith is derived from its object. Have you ever heard anybody say, maybe you've said it, maybe I've said it, if I just had enough faith, I could do great things here. If I just had enough faith. Well, what we're going to see in the couple of passages that I want to look at with you here to close the class today is the quantity of your faith is of very little significance. I don't know if you knew that or not. It has everything to do with the object of your faith. I want to look at a passage with you to show you the point. These are just the ideas throughout the book about Jesus. Oh, yes. Didn't mean to skip over this. The author does issue 5 warnings in the book. And we're not going to talk about them today. We will when we get to them. But here are the warnings in the book. There's 5 of them. Danger of neglect. Danger of unbelief. Danger of not maturing. Danger of drawing back. And the danger of refusing God. Those 5 warnings find themselves in the book, and we'll talk about them as we reach them. Okay, here's what I want to talk to you here at the end. This is Jesus talking with the disciples. He says this to them. Take heed to yourselves. If your brother sins against you, rebuke him. And if he repents, forgive him. And if he sins against you 7 times in a day, and 7 times in a day returns to you saying, I repent, you shall forgive him. We talked a lot about that in our class on the cross last time, about forgiveness, God's forgiveness for us, and how we're to be forgiving ourselves. But as he told them this, and you have to remember that the rabbis of Jesus' day said, you have to forgive 3 times. After that 3rd one, you don't have to forgive anymore. Now, I want you to think, can you imagine what the disciples must have thought when Jesus said, 7 times in a day he returns to you saying? Another place he said 70 times 7. Just the idea of just keep on forgiving. So I think the disciples are absolutely stunned by this statement. So they say to Jesus, increase our faith. Now you would think that's a pretty good thing to pray for or to ask Jesus to do, isn't it? Lord, increase our faith. And you would think possibly that the next verse would have Jesus saying something along the lines of, that's a great request. You got it. I'll increase your faith so that you can put into practice what I've told you to do here. That's not what he said. In fact, what he said doesn't really make a lot of sense initially, but it does when you look at it and think about it. So the Lord said, if you have faith as a mustard seed, you can say to this mulberry tree, be pulled up by the roots and be planted into the sea, and it would obey you. Jesus is telling the disciples it has nothing to do with the quantity of your faith. It's the quality of your faith. It's who you have your faith in. So what is the object of your faith? What I'm saying is the strength of your faith is directly related to the strength of who you believe in. So who are you believing in? In fact, Jesus dispersed with the idea that the quantity of faith is important. If you have faith as a mustard seed, that's a mustard seed. Look at how tiny that is. Another picture between the forefinger and thumb. Look at how small that is. Jesus says if you had that much faith, you can do these impossible things. That mustard seed is small. I just ran across this in my study. It's 0.039 to 0.079 inches in diameter. Now, for those of you who don't like math, didn't like math, still don't like math, let me tell you, that's tiny. That's not much. Increase our faith, Lord. No, you got it wrong. You need to have faith in me. Put your faith in me. You can do what I told you to do if your faith is in the right object, and that would be me. And so Hebrews is going to help us to see the object of our faith, because here it is. Our faith will be strong if we believe and understand that the object of our faith is immensely strong. Let me say that to you again. Our faith will be strong if we believe and understand the object of our faith is strong. Hebrews is one of the most Christ-centered, if not the most Christ-centered book in the New Testament. Colossians is too. But Hebrews may be the most Christ-centered book. And it focuses on Jesus and is one of the greatest books to have immersed in your heart in times of discouragement, in times of temptation, in times of defeat. It emphasizes over and over the character and quality of Jesus. And if we see him as he is, we cannot help but have strong faith. And it doesn't take much of that, Jesus says. A mustard seed of faith. And so that's what the book of Hebrews will do for us. It will help us focus on the one who is already in the place of victory. We are fighting a victory already won, and that ought to encourage us. Now I want to, just in the little time we have left, I want to go over to Mark chapter 9 to reiterate this point, and then we'll be through today. And when he came to the disciples, he saw a great multitude around them and scribes disputing with them. Immediately, when they saw him, all the people were greatly amazed and running to him, greeting him. And he asked the scribes, "What are you discussing with them?" Then one from the multitude answered and said, "Teacher, I brought you my son who has a mute spirit. And wherever he seizes him, he throws him down. He foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, and becomes rigid." Wouldn't that be awful? Have your son in that condition? This guy's desperate. So I spoke to your disciples that they should cast him out, but they could not. Now listen, we're going to address that point here in just a second. But before this happened, Jesus had already sent them out and given them the power to cast out demons, and they had done it. But for some reason, they can't cast this one out. Jesus answered him and said, "O faithless generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I bear with you? Bring him to me." Then they brought him to him, and when he saw him, immediately the spirit convulsed him, and he fell on the ground and wallowed, foaming at the mouth. So he asked his father, "How long has this been happening to him?" And he said, "From childhood. And often he has thrown him both into the fire and into the water to destroy him. But if you can now watch this. Watch this. If you can do anything," the man says to Jesus, "have compassion on us and help us." Well, the man had the if in the wrong place. Jesus said to him, "If you can believe, all things are possible to him who believes." And immediately the father and child cried out and said with tears, "Lord, I believe, help my unbelief." The writer in Hebrews is going to talk a lot about unbelief. "Lord, I believe, help my unbelief." When Jesus saw that the people came running together, he rebuked the clean spirit, saying to him, "You deaf and dumb spirit, I command you, come out of him and enter him no more." Then the spirit cried out, convulsed him greatly, and came out of him, and he became as one dead, so that many said, "He is dead." But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he arose. So Jesus rearranged the man's thinking. This has nothing to do with me. I've got the power. Do you believe? Something else I'd want to say to you. Notice that Jesus said, "All things are possible to him who believes." Some people read into that, well, then he's going to do everything that I ask him to do for me. And some people fall away from Christ because they can't understand why in the world this God of total power doesn't address the circumstance in the way I think it should be addressed. And so they begin to doubt Jesus and his power. Jesus said, all things are possible to him who believes. I really believe the heart of the Christian ought to be the heart of Jesus in the garden. Lord, let this cup pass from me, but your will be done. And then I want to close with this. When he had come into the house, his disciples asked him privately, how come we couldn't cast him out? And so he said to them, this kind can come out by nothing but prayer and fasting. What does that tell you? They had done what we are so prone to do. They had turned away from the true power and thought the power resided in themselves. This comes out by prayer and fasting. In other words, total dependence upon the one who has the power. I really believe the disciples had become kind of highfalutin, thinking the power resided in them and they could do this, and forgot where the power came from. Folks, we can do the very same thing in our Christian walk. We can forget it's all of God, an all-powerful God. We need him. And this book is going to tell us in a very real way how that happens. And so Jesus taught a great lesson to that day, to that man, to those who stood there and heard his words, and to us today. Don't forget who has the power. Whatever level of faith you've got, put it in him. And if you will, all things are possible.